Good morning, everybody. I'm Saskia, and I'm the founder and director of the Institute, and on this call also is Minetta. Minetta, you want to say hi, introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I am the Director of Operations here in the cloud of the Institute for Art and Olfaction.
Welcome, Aleesa, and thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for coming. I've prepared a talk that's about 40 minutes, I think. We'll see. In my practice, that's sort of what it was. Afterwards, I thought we could talk and sort of go, if we need to go back to something or think it through. And you know, some of the connections that I'm making are, well, all the connections I'm making are very much along the lines of my interests. So I'm very curious to hear what other people have to say and what they've been thinking about related to this, and especially in the last days, given what's happened in Lebanon. So my talk today is about a scent-based scent-based weapon, and in particular scent-based violence. And I'm going to focus on this weapon called skunk. And I'm going to go through the history a little bit. I'm going to go through my research, the connections that it has to my interest, to my artistic practice, and to my work in general. It's well understood by many of us, especially many of us here, and by perfumers and by neuroscientists, that smell is a powerful factor in human self-awareness. Smell impacts our emotions and our behavior. They influence our understandings of comfort, safety, and disgust, and they act as strong ties to our memories and past experiences. I'm going to try to do this at the same time. Okay. The human olfactory system connects directly to the limbic system of the brain that many of us know. And the amygdala and the hippocampus regulate our emotions, our fear responses, and memories. And moreover, the olfactory system's connections to the amygdala and hippocampus are more direct than any other human sense perception system. And this allows us to begin to understand why smell and emotion are so closely linked. And it's relatively easy to speak about the so-called positive manifestations of these dynamics, which we hear all the time, like the smell of, I don't know, familiar soap reminding you about a time with a former lover, or when smells are perceived as nice things, you sort of recall memories like my grandmother's kitchen, for example. But when smells are perceived as foul, these connections can be difficult and capitalized upon it in a number of ways. And over the last few years, my artistic research has focused on these ideas, how scent can challenge the barriers to our bodies as something we take in from the external world, revealing the inextricable ways we are connected to our atmospheres and each other, and potentially made vulnerable by these connections. When a scent is deemed good or bad, they can reaffirm culturally determined values of hygiene and disgust, values that are loaded with racialized and class-based associations. And in particular, I'm interested in how scent can be deployed to enact violence, be it emotional, psychological, cultural, or physical, acting from the complicated nexus of these dynamics around emotion, memory, vulnerability, and social value. With the help of writer and researcher Daniela Sanader and filmmaker and activist Aleesa Cohene, I've been exploring these ideas through a particular case study, the formula of a non-lethal, quote, non-lethal malodorant weapon known primarily as skunk, or skunk water. Skunk was originally developed by Odor Tech, an Israeli manufacturer in collaboration with the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, and has international marketing distribution from a Maryland-based company called Mistral Security. Mistral's marketing material introduces skunk as a non-toxic, non-volatile, organic liquid with the viscosity of water, which can be dispersed at crowds in a cannon, like with a water cannon, or other munition devices. And in their language, it generates a highly pungent smell that disperses crowds in a matter of seconds, shutting down escalating situations. But Odor Tech was founded by a management team at the Israeli company, by the Israeli company called Flybuster, And Flybuster is a firm that develops scent-based chemicals to repel and kill insects. And it's clear that Odortech applied Flybuster's pesticide logic to Palestinians, who Israeli leaders have long viewed as subhuman contaminants, comparable to insects. And like most Israeli weapons, skunk water is advertised as having been field tested, which almost always means that Palestinians were used as human test subjects during the development process. It's hard to talk about. While Gaza serves as a playground for larger weapons, the West Bank in Israel's preferred laboratory for testing and refining crowd control technology. So Gaza, and we see this all the time, Gaza is like where bombs go off, and then the West Bank is sort of more experimental. Israeli Police Superintendent Ben David Harosh stated in 2008 that skunk water was tested in monitored exercises, and I quote, in the Palestinian villages of Bilin and Nilin, which he referred to as an experiment. I've heard from friends and activists this year that the village of Bilin still in the West Bank is known to have a perceptible shit smell. Skunk is made from a secret formula, and I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what it is. And I haven't. It's a mixture of yeast, baking soda, and water, and the full list of ingredients has not been made public. Translated as shit water in Arabic and Hebrew, skunk is used primarily by the IDF and the Israeli police with great frequency between 2008 and 2007. And in the overwhelming majority of cases, deployment of skunk is directed at Palestinians. Skunk water smells like a mixture of shit, vomit, and rotting bodies. It stays on the skin, clothes, and furniture for weeks, sometimes permanently, and depending on the frequency of spraying, forever. As American activist Dr. David Nur articulates, he says, only another pathetic reminder, if anyone could forget it, of the stench of occupation. Given these patterns, it's clear that skunk has become a tool of collective punishment and humiliation, weaponizing smell to deepen the level of colonialization in the air, landscape, homes, even bodies and clothing of Palestinian daily life. I'll return to these dynamics in a moment, but I want to back up a little bit and spend a little bit more time with the malodorant itself and the ways in which it's marketed, because I find this particularly interesting. Much of the written copy that accompanies skunk touts its perceived like non-toxic nature as a significant advantage to the malodorant. Because while other crowd control weapons such as tear gas and rubber bullets pose as potential threat to actual bodies of protesters or the environment in which they are deployed, skunk's non-toxic and totally organic composition frames the malodorant as a more ethical, humanitarian, even environmentally friendly choice for crowd control. A repeated refrain throughout skunk's marketing materials echoes a statement made by Superintendent David Ben Harosh, who I've spoken about. And he says, you could safely drink the substance, but you wouldn't want to. While advantageous for sales opportunities, these claims are dangerous and reductive for a number of reasons, many of which I don't have time to elaborate on here. But there are numerous reports and studies that highlight how skunk, a so-called non-lethal weapon, has caused pain, significant injury, damage, and in some cases death. And since the full list of ingredients for the skunk malodorant is not public, any claims to the substance's safety are left entirely to the control and in the control of the manufacturers themselves. So despite this lack of accountability, or perhaps because of it, skunk has entered the global weapons industry. After early and sustained use against Palestinians, the now profitable malodorant is being marketed and sold on an international scale. Significantly, I've been able to locate at least one purchase of the malodorant in the United States. Skunk was ordered by the St. Louis Metropolitan Police in 2014, designated as a so-called emergency purchase, made only months after the Ferguson protests of the police shooting of Michael Brown. Academic and writer Sean Shu, who some of you know, recently called my attention to an assortment of tweets and other social media posts made by individuals calling for the use of skunk against protesters organizing in the wake of George Floyd's murder by police. And even if the use of skunk has diminished, there seems to be an ongoing call for a weapon of its nature, something that doles out punishment, dehumanizes its victims, all along sensory lines. As can be seen, the weaponization of smell is essential to this process. As I conducted this research, there was a major character that sort of interested me most, and her work adds further elucidation and complication to these questions around the weaponization of scent. Dr. Ruth Pinney is a retired US naval commander who served in the Office of Naval Research as a biochemist specializing in neuroendocrinology, and she invented a non-toxic malodorant weapon highly similar to skunk. Dr. Pinney is listed as the inventor of a malodorant weapon in 2001 in a 2001 US patent. And given that the first documented uses of skunk in Palestine were from 2008, I've been interested in exploring whether there's a direct causal connection between Pinney's formula and skunk itself. I was able to interview Pinney on one occasion. I spoke to her on the phone, and she insists that her formula has not been used in Palestine, outlining that the IDF formula uses yeast while hers does not. However, even if the weapons are entirely distinct from one another, as Pinney suggests, their simultaneous invention in two parts of the world says a great deal about the ongoing desire to find new avenues for doing harm in this way. It's also worth noting that these are two countries with long-standing political relationships. Both are known for heavy militarization of their domestic police forces. The IDF also provides training to US police departments on an ongoing basis. Both are known for settler occupation and for highly fraught legacies of racialized violence. And these connection points have been the subject of my research for quite some time. Yet, what also remains of interest to me is the complicated dualism at the core of scent-based weapons, both their inherent violence and the ways in which they are routinely affirmed by their supporters as safer, more ethical, non-lethal, or the bizarrely slippery descriptor, less lethal, which tends to circulate around crowd control weaponry. In interviewing Dr. Pinney, it remains clear that she continues to think of her work as fundamentally humanitarian in nature. In our discussions, she cited a particular anecdote as the inspiration for her malodorant. In an unnamed country, an enemy militia attacked a US embassy and shielded themselves behind pregnant women. The embassy was unable to retaliate without fear of harming the women and their unborn children. So apparently it was at this moment that then Pinney decided to invent a weapon that could be used even on pregnant women. I have yet to find any additional sources that can corroborate this anecdote, nor has Pinney responded to my follow-up questions for clarification around this detail. And whether this circumstance is true or speculative, it articulates a great deal about the perceived value of a weapon like skunk, using the vulnerability of pregnant women to justify a malodorant's more humane form of violence. Dr. Pinney continues to be an interesting figure for my research. In both our interview and elsewhere, she has spoken at great lengths about the relationship between smell and trauma, a relationship that appears to remain central to her career. As she expressed in our interview, she's interested in using smell, particularly her own blends of essential oils, to help children recover from trauma, using a process she refers to as healing through quantum consciousness, or healing through the vibrational power of scent molecules. She also indicated that she herself suffers from PTSI, post-traumatic stress injury, due to her military service. And since her malodorant invention, she has developed a range of scent neutralizing balms marketed for various users, from children with autism disorder spectrums, from autism spectrum disorders, to first responders and firefighters, to disaster cleanup crews, and also to more intensive military usage. And as an aside, in our conversation, she indicated that her military-grade scent neutralizer was, quote, sold to the Israelis. So given this range of work, it's clear that she's deeply aware of the power of smell, both its capacities to cause significant harm and what she perceives as its healing properties as well. Yet in developing her weaponized malodorant, she used the so-called humanitarian focus of her work to validate her uneasy balancing act between enabling scent-based violence and helping others recover from it. In other words, discriminating between who she determines as deserving or undeserving of trauma. When I asked Dr. Pinney about Palestinian children being sprayed with skunk water in their classrooms, of which there are several reported incidents, she deflected that children wouldn't be sprayed unless they were rioting, ultimately dismissing the claim entirely. She then said, Hamas puts out a lot of disinformation. And towards the end of our interview, she also mentioned that her newest project was centered around using smell to support the victims of child trafficking. She's a weird woman. A lot can be learned about the ways Dr. Pinney positions herself and what this says about the power of smell, how it's capable of carrying so many divergent associations, both violent and humane, both healing and contaminating. And I see this as fundamentally connected to the ways in which smell interacts with our neurological systems, those deep ties to our brain's emotional, memory, and fear processing centers I discussed earlier. And additionally, there's interesting research around the experiential nature of scent perception. Much of what we perceive as good or bad smells are learned through the smeller's lived experience and particular cultural associations, which is why it's impossible to produce and weaponize a universally reviled smell. Yet it's worth separating a scent's connotations, whether it's liked or disliked on a personal, emotional, experiential level, and how it interacts with the brain itself. Many smells can cause irritation or pain through a process that's entirely distinct from the olfactory system. The brain's trigeminal nerve allows us to pick up on the feel of a smell, like the coolness of mint, for instance, but also can produce intense or painful physiological reactions when a smell's trigeminal component is strong, like when you sneeze after smelling pepper or cry when you cut onions. And weapons that activate the brain's trigeminal nerve, like tear gas, for instance, are forbidden under the Chemical Weapons Convention, which the US signed in '93 and ratified in '97, and Israel signed in '93 and has yet to ratify. However, it's worth mentioning that the CWC only bans use of weapons for international warfare. They're allowed in types and quantities for use in domestic law enforcement. And I've been reading reports that claim that skunk apparently does not activate the brain's trigeminal nerve, which would place the malodorant in a significant loophole with regards to the CWC, potentially making it more attractive on the international non-lethal weapons market. However, given the intensity of the experience of the malodorant and who's experiencing it, as described by people who have experienced it firsthand, I would like to see more substantiated research about skunk's potential trigeminal impact. I doubt that's the case. And of course, trigeminal or not, this is not to say that skunk does not have a neurological impact at all. It's quite the opposite. The malodorant triggers a flight response in the amygdala, for instance, and it's my contention that the weapon produces a complex range of harm across simultaneous neurological, social, emotional, and racialized lines. Skunk is indeed a collective punitive measure, as it has been described by Israeli human rights group B'Tselem. And I see collective here as meaning both groups of people and various ways of punishing. And I've read reports of skunk being sprayed into Palestinian homes and neighborhoods, into schools, onto funeral processions. And as Ramallah-based activist Miriam Barghouti indicates, she says, the water lingers on your skin to a point when you want to rip your skin off. So not only does it cause an immediate physical impact, but it's known to stick to skin, hair, and clothing for weeks on end. And this not only serves as a surveillance tactic, effectively marking protesters or activists for later identification, but it also carries significant social and emotional damage. To smell of shit for days and weeks is to be humiliated, to be ostracized from your communities, to be fundamentally dehumanized. Then imagine that sensation extrapolated outwards onto an entire community, as skunk is sprayed across entire Palestinian neighborhoods and towns. And as I have explored in some work I've done with scholars Sean Shu and Jean-Thomas Tremblay, given smells deep ties to emotion, memory, and identity formation, it's easy to understand how smell impacts our sense of belonging amongst groups. In our essay that I worked on with Sean and Jean-Thomas, called Skunk, Olfactory Violence and Morbid Speculation, they write, if smell is how we come to know our past, or how we come to feel attuned with a place or community, then what are the psychological impacts of the intense and prolonged olfactory discomfort inflicted by skunk? Enacting scent-based violence along these lines also works to reaffirm Israeli settler colonial ideologies that understand Palestinians as dirty, as less than human, as animals, as literally smelling of shit. And if, as discussed, smell plays a strong role in how we come to understand ourselves within these communities, and if judgments about smell are culturally loaded and learned through experience, then it's easy to understand how these factors can accumulate. And when we come to learn socially constructed value of a specific community through scent itself. Therefore, spraying Palestinian neighborhoods with the smell of literal shit helps the IDF to produce the very racist associations that are used to further justify the violence enacted against those communities. And it's a complex feedback loop with significant emotional, psychological, social, and neurological repercussions. Yet, given the power of scent to signify multiple values at once, think of Penny's assertion of her humanitarian work, the IDF is able to subtly trivialize their own violence, claiming it's just a smell, after all. Even naming the weapon skunk works to undervalue the damage, and that and to see the weapon, to see at all that the weapon is capable of reassociating it with an animal's natural defense mechanism in order to further justify its humane or ethical deployment. So this is sort of the summary of the research that we have done, and sort of brings me now to end the talk a little bit with talking about my own work and my own research and how to think about this, how I'm thinking about this in context of that. And so I wanted to speak briefly about how a focus on scent and violence emerged in my work. For the past 2 decades, I've been stockpiling film footage, from VHS and Betamax tapes to direct-to-video DVDs to archival film reels to 3rd and 4th generation digital files. And in my practice, I employ strategies of appropriation centered primarily on acts of re-editing and sampling existing film dialogue, clipped images, and sound effects. And in installations, I work in sort of multi-part installations, and I rework the film material, releasing diverse images and audio from their original contexts and assigning them new functions within a codified structure I've developed. And mining these thousands of clips, I accumulate the actions, gestures, and expressions of various bodies to produce linearly edited composite characters, that's what I call them, and narratives for multi-channel video-based installation work. And here's an image of Yes Angel from 2012, and you can see this is, so you'd enter the installation space. It's a 3-channel video. You see them come up as the narrative plays, and underneath the seated area is a scent composition that was built from different aspects of the molecular composition of blood. So it smells a little bit like blood, and some other things that come up in the story. And so you smell that. You don't know where it's coming from. You just sit there and you can experience it. These narratives have addressed themes such as the function of racism in North American immigration policy, social movement building during AIDS hysteria, associative dynamics between dream analysts and their clients, and broken communication between queer lovers. At its core, my work grapples with how hard and how important it is to imagine the world being different than it is. And this is a piece with multi-channels. The multi-channels are to the right in this room in particular, and this is you. When you sit in this chair, you are in the position of being a patient of this dream analyst. So as I've said a little bit, my source material is often from Hollywood cinema. In this particular piece, it's from all the films that Gilles Deleuze mentions in his 2 books on cinema. So I collected those and worked with them. And nonetheless, this fraught visual culture, wherever the source is coming from, allows me to engage with the content of known cliches and conventions, and all the assumptions, often unspoken or implied, but deeply present, that allow people to uphold the status quo, white supremacy, and by extension, justify acts of violence. As I reconfigure this content in order to produce new narratives, the characters I create are in new relationships, learning how to express complicated feelings or becoming critical of their own entitlements. But regardless, they're still unable to escape the hegemony of which they constitute and participate in, and something I recognize to be an extension of my own entangled advantages. Because of this, I'm very interested in creating situations that allow myself and others to hold opposing and even contradictory emotions at once. Which brings me to my interest in scent. I began mixing and diffusing custom scents into my video installations, designing scents that reflected the emotional impact of each project starting in 2006. As I studied and practiced, I began to understand that working with scent allows me to explore embodied associations differently, much differently actually, and materializing ideas that couldn't be translated visually. Because of scent's inextricable connection to our emotions, our memories, our social values, as expressed on a visceral level, it has become the ideal focus for these aspects of my work, allowing me to explore through nonverbal and non-visual means how we come to desire some things, reject others, or outwardly yearn to change while implicitly upholding capitalist norms of domination along lines of race, class, sex, gender, ability, etc. Thinking through Dr. Pinney's dual justifications around her work with scent has helped further solidify this focus of my work. The idea that scent is elastic, malleable enough for her to feel as if she is doing the work of healing while simultaneously enacting violence. Scent is uniquely capable of articulating these opposing demands within itself. This piece here is called Hate You, and it's an extension of this work here, and it's a session number 2 that the spectator has with this composite character who's a dream analyst. Given how scent evokes deeply personal emotional reactions while being culturally learned, using scent in my work also helps reframe my own individual bias and personal experience and how it functions within structural racism and privilege. And so, for instance, my project I Don't Get It, which is a series of 8 video and sculptural works from 2017, centers the study of whiteness as a racialized position to contest its dominance and to expose how it functions as a mythical norm. The project samples mainstream films made since 2001 that deal directly or obliquely with race, examining how narratives of an illusory post-racial cultural moment reaffirm the centrality of whiteness and disrupt meaningful conversations around racial justice and injustice. This is the 2-channel video from that piece, and you can see these 2 views. And this is an installation. The video work is behind here that you just saw, and then this is a start of seeing some of the sculptures. I Don't Get It features a sculpture that diffuses a custom-made scent called Whoa Pineapple Nails. And this scent combines various associations from personal to cultural and political that speak to the ways in which whiteness continually recenters itself while absorbing the cultural reference points of others. The scent's base accord features notes of wood shavings and sawdust, which reference my father's wood carving work. He made the base of the sculpture, which I then built upon. As a white Jewish Canadian man, he routinely appropriates indigenous wood carving techniques in his work, and we've had long conversations and arguments about this practice and what it means. But however the conversation evolves, he doesn't recognize this as a problem. Putting a note of wood shavings at the base of this scent allows me to stay close to this problem, to recognize how it operates within myself and my family, and to emulate that through scent. The middle and top notes are an overripe, almost rotting pineapple accord, and the top then a nail salon, respectively. Both pineapples and manicures are visual reference points in the video installation itself, which is how I generally work. I work sort of in this sort of domino effect when something is referenced, and if it has sort of more meaning to me, I will take it up in the next piece of work if it's unresolved for me. And I understand, so here we have, when I'm talking about the pineapple and the nail salon, I understand both references in this particular case to have complex cultural and racialized associations. And so without diving into it too deeply, pineapples were historically understood as a highly prized exotic item in the colonial European economy, one extracted from indigenous lands and shipped to the banquet tables of the white and ultra wealthy, and have since transformed into symbols of hospitality, an example of whiteness, which I see as an example of how whiteness maintains its power through performed codes of kindness, which is something I think about a lot. And then the top scent, which is something that people notice at first and really quickly disappears, is the inside of a nail salon. And these spaces, nail salons are very interesting in this particular work for many reasons, this body of work rather, and because they remain loaded along lines of race and class, and from a woman's manicure and along feminist lines, from a woman's manicure as a signal of upward mobility to other forms of nail art rooted in Black women's aesthetics and culture, to the often unethical labor practices of salons themselves, hiring low-wage, precarious, racialized women workers for exploitative and hazardous work. It's also a point of pride. It's also a point of community. And combining all of this together, the wood shavings, the ripe pineapple, and a nail salon to produce Whoa pineapple nails has allowed me to olfactively reference much of what I've discussed today. Scent's capacity to hold conflicting emotions at once, be the ideals of kindness or hospitality, upward mobility, humanitarian ethics, or a desire for social change. While maintaining ingrained forms of prejudice, inequality, violence, using scent to communicate both aspirations and complicities. So here, what I'm trying to show is just this combination of how it could happen all at once, and then sensibility to do so all at once. And so we have like this experience that hopefully gives that to the spectator, and hopefully gives that to people who are experiencing it. Yeah, and so how I understand where my practice connects back to this ongoing work with skunk and what remains of interest as I move forward is very much in this capacity. And so if smell might be able to increase our capacity to hold complex emotions within ourselves, I feel like it can teach us a great deal about how we come to uphold some things and vilify others, sometimes within the same intake of a breath. And because it is something fundamentally nonverbal and non-visual, scent remains a productive challenge in my work as an artist, and it gives me space to explore ideas that are implicit, unconscious, and found between the lines. I would love to have a conversation now.
Thank you, Aleesa.
Can only go so far with that, that mode. But I'd love to hear from everybody and what everybody is thinking and where that leaves you, and if you feel like participating. I really welcome it.
I think the idea of weaponizing scent is such a fascinating one, because as you touched on in your talk, that sort of intangible yet tangible sort of trail that it leaves on you, you know, that you can't get rid of for days, is such a marker in society of sort of other, and it equates the body with being disgusting, and you know, it's powerful, you know, in a sinister way, you know, obviously, but yeah, I'd be curious about if anybody has thought about that, or what you think about that further, Aleesa, you know, if there's anything further to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that always that really catches me that I tried to focus on in different ways is just the capacity for it to be sinister and lovely, and to then like what do I do with those two things? I mean, in the case of skunk, that isn't the case, but it is. I mean, it is. I wouldn't say lovely, but it is effective to the people using it, and they get to say it's just a smell.
Yeah, it's just a smell.
And I think that is what is particularly interesting about and about smell, and can't be captured either. And but I think that it's just a call to increase a capacity to hold these things at once, and to it's not one or the other, and to act on that, to act even though, because it's not one or the other. Like, what can I now do? What will I now make because of this? How at least those are my questions. Yeah.
On a very practical note, I mean, I was with you, I think, when we very carefully tried to open it in the back, you know, alley of the Institute. So when you've been researching the smell itself, I mean, what are your impressions of it? I mean, and I know you had hoped to actually get samples to everybody, but we weren't able to make it happen. So I'm sorry for that, everybody.
Yeah.
And maybe so people can smell it too.
Yeah, it is available for purchase on like for self-defense by Mistral, through Mistral Securities, which I didn't want anyone to support. So
Yeah, it's the
we
problem.
didn't we didn't get more of it. So, but I do have a small amount of it, and in a very small, in my small experience, it's just like it smells like rotting eggs, or it's very sulfuric. It's nothing you want near you. I mean, I cannot, and that's the thing that's so devastating, is I cannot imagine that being in the air. I cannot imagine that being in my environment, walking through it. It's something that immediately you want to contain and be like, oh, okay, there's that. Now put it away. And even in the way that I store it, it's in, I don't know, 3 or 4 boxes so that it doesn't come out, and it's just a tiny little vial.
Yeah,
Yeah.
let alone infused in your clothing.
Yeah.
It's an interesting thing, because, you know, so speaking about the real smell of skunk, you know, you'll be driving down the street, especially here in LA where we have so many, and you'll smell it, you'll go, it's not so bad, you know. And that experience of just sort of, you know, being able to opt in and also drive away is very different from when you have an animal that's been sprayed by that smell, and suddenly it's like the agency is, I think that's what it is about these aromatic weapons also, is you're also removing people's agency from opting out, you know, like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I was thinking recently, like when I approached a skunk last night, and I was scared, like a little bit, like I was like, I don't want to make it scared. Like that was my instinct. It was like, okay, if I scare it, it will defend itself. And that is a part of the ideology, at least in Israel, around this. It's about self-defense. So skunk helps tell that story too. We're just defending ourselves.
Right.
And it smells nothing like skunk too. So
yeah, it's quite a bit worse, if I recall.
I mean, there's no correlation other than the name. There's no correlation other than the manipulation of the name, actually.
Yeah. Heather's asking, they're curious about your thoughts and about the relationship of weaponized smell and trauma.
Can you clarify? Like, it's, maybe I'll read it so I understand it.
Yeah, Heather, feel free to unmute and ask if you'd like.
Sure. Hi.
Hey.
Thank you so much. The talk was so interesting. I guess it's because I've been working lately on things with the parasympathetic nervous system and trauma and how that happens. And based on just interest in smell previously, I was thinking about how those two things kind of come together, since we know that smell is so important or so implicated from memory, that there might be some intention to create an effect that then would, you know, continue to affect people when they smell it later, if it's sticking on their skin, like you say, and just keeping people in a constant state of, you know, not being able to function as well because they're sensing this experience once again.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it can work both ways. I think it will continue. Like, I mean, we know that from a bad smell, if we smell, people are often triggered by a smell first before even remembering or thinking about a traumatic event. I don't know if it answers your question, but I also, I mean, not that I'd recommend Ruth Pinney, but that's her life's work, is to reverse these traumatic, to heal through scent, particularly on that level. And I don't know how I feel about, I mean, I think that retraining the brain is very, very possible. I also think you're always going to run up against the opposite happening. You retrain it and you smell something good, or you sort of create a situation in which you smell this, you know that there's something triggering a trauma, and then you can combine it with something else. Then you have a new memory, but I don't think that trauma goes away. I mean, I think you can just add to it or redirect it, or at least in my research and my own experience. I think something that's been interesting for me in terms of that is, and this is not about trauma, but it's about when I show work in different contexts and there's different reactions to the work, the scent is different. It smells completely different to me. And I think that's true of perfume we wear too. Like around different people, we enjoy it more. Around other people, we don't. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, they're really just like my surface thoughts. I'd have to think more about it. I have not gone into it deeper than what I've talked about. I'm much sort of more interested on a political level and sort of thinking it through that way.
So an added thought from Tessa is this to Heather's question is, and I quote now, "This was the same question I was going to ask. Do you think there's a way to rehabilitate the trauma done to victims of skunk to allow them to reprogram their associations, shame and anger, etc.?"
Yeah, I mean, I don't. Yeah, outside of that context, I'm not sure. I mean, it's just so continual. I don't know. The last report that we found of skunk being used was actually in a very ultra Orthodox group of Jews in who were protesting against, I think, going into military service. Well, for sure they don't go into military service, but they were protesting against something else. Anyway, it was used with them too.
Like sprayed on them?
Sprayed on them as protesters. And but the Palestinian, these smaller West Bank villages still smell of skunk. I don't think my first interest in this was about building a neutralizer, and Saskia and I talked a lot about that, and like what would it mean, and could we do this, because that was also Pinny's intention. At first I thought maybe she had a change of heart, but upon digging and speaking with Daniela and Isa more, I thought it's like she just can hold both. It's just both are true for her. She built this like very interesting vanilla. It's not so interesting, but it's like very strong vanilla. What's it called? I guess neutralizer to put under between your nose and your lip to smell, which then is supposed to eradicate the smell of skunk, among other things. It sort of works. I've tried it, but I've never been I don't think it would work in.
But it also doesn't account for the sorry, I didn't mean to jump in.
No, go ahead.
It doesn't account for the fact that it's one thing that you're having a hard time with the smell of skunk. The other thing is that you're marked with the smell socially, and that doesn't help to have a vanilla smell above your lip. It's
no. It's clearly it's one of the reasons I read that the IDF stopped using it so much is because the soldiers were complaining that they went home smelling too badly, and so. No, it doesn't. It does not help. It's just decorative. Yeah, I think there are ways. I think that there are ways, but there are ways of, like, you cannot. I don't think there are ways in that context. I mean, the trauma is happening on so many levels in Palestine that I don't think, and that's why I sort of left that question in my research, because it was just too devastating to think about, like, any kind of solution, actually, and rather than like just increasing awareness and increasing information, getting this out to start with, at least.
Do you know that if the St. Louis police ever deployed it in Ferguson or in St. Louis?
I read one article that they tested it and then it didn't work. It didn't come out of the cannons properly. No, I don't think they used it in the end.
Okay, Donna has some thoughts. So Donna says, she was wondering how the skunk smell is dispersed. Is it, yeah.
It comes out of water cannons, like huge water cannons that shoot into the air. And it's like, it's like it has the consistency of thick water, like sort of mucus-like water.
Yum. And then Donna was thinking also, I guess you already sort of answered this, but designing a smell to sort of spray back, a retaliation smell, actually, she talks about, versus a neutralizer.
Yeah. I'd love to talk about that more. I mean, this was sort of my first questions at the beginning of my research, and it just became the experience itself became it was too important to think about the experience of it itself rather than retaliating. And I didn't hear from any of the Palestinian activists that I spoke to. It was just sort of the lesser of all evils, even though it was a point of my interest because of the work that I do. And I sort of just took that as, I just wanted to respect that. Even if I could see like, no, there's so many lasting and important, horrible things that are happening because of this. It's just people's lives are at stake. And so, okay, they smell like shit, but they're alive. And that was the feedback that I got. So unless it's done with and by and for the people who need it, I just sort of became uninterested in anything else. But if there was a group of people there interested, I'd be very, very happy to work with them, and to anyone else who would be interested in talking and thinking more.
Okay, Donna, I hope that answers your question. Are there any other questions from people, or thoughts or comments for Aleesa? I know sometimes it takes a minute, so we can allow for a little. Oh, okay, well, Susie, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Says, thank you, Aleesa, so inspiring. I saw some of your work quite some years back in Berlin at Suvi Lehtinen's gallery. I wonder if you have worked on scents to evoke particular emotional reactions, for example, to induce crying or laughter from your audience.
Yeah, I try not to control the specific emotion, but what I like to do is sort of create more of a tone or a mood, and then whatever comes from that is interesting to me. I mean, I know myself, I'll cry in situations that many people wouldn't, and vice versa, and laugh as well, and that sort of even. I think what's interesting to me is to create an environment where maybe those instincts or even inappropriate instincts that we might have deemed inappropriate can be expressed. And I much prefer the environments for my work to be dark for that reason, and that people can be in there in smaller groups, maybe one at a time, so that those experiences are possible. But I don't know, I don't want that power to induce crying or laughter. Not that specifically, but I like the question. Yeah, I don't feel comfortable with expecting how anyone would react, but I formulate it based on what I think is happening in the work as a point of expansion, like where do I need to grow to understand what's happening here, and then I work from there.
Chacha's wondering, sort of on a technicality, how small of a sample of skunk can be distributed? Like, is this a tiny drop, or is it? Do you know the technicalities of how it's distributed, how it's put in?
Well, what we have came from a very, like, I guess like 100 milliliters, I think, of sort of sold like mace, like for self-defense, and it could be distributed. Like, I could send someone something in any amount. I would be happy to do that if someone wanted to.
Is that what you meant, Chach? Do you want to ask?
Yeah. I was starting to write a message. Yeah, I was wondering, just because you said it's so powerful in strength, and so I'm just wondering, because you mentioned about sending samples, and I was wondering if it was the tiniest drop, that, and how far does it travel, compare, or is if would it be invisible, or one drop, or a microliter? What
you're asking about the potency? Is that what you mean? Sort of?
Yeah, one drop is gross.
Okay, so it needs to be less than that even.
For what?
Well, because I can imagine, I mean, I'd be interested to smell it.
Yeah.
But how
how
small of an amount is reasonable?
I mean, when we were thinking a little bit about okay, well, if we were to distribute samples, I was thinking, I was in my studio, I was like, okay, how would I do this? And I thought I would put one drop, maybe this answers your question. I would put one drop on a scent strip, in a plastic Ziploc, tight plastic Ziploc, and then that in another envelope. And then the option you have then are like threefold. You can smell it through the two plastics, the one, or the scent strip itself, if you're daring.
So strong. Whoa.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the
And-
reasons, you know, we sort of veered away from sending samples was basically we're sending aromatic weapons through the U.S. Postal Service, you know, and not to mention, you know, all the use of plastics. So I don't know. I mean, we can facilitate it, but I'm not keen on it, to be honest.
Yeah. It's curious to hear. It's just good to know like that is the answer, because I've like never encountered a potent smell before. I don't need. I mean, of course I don't want to.
Yeah. It's no different than walking past rotting garbage. It's not that surprising that way, you know, like, because there is something familiar about it, which I find sort of at the core of my research been the most fascinating, because it smells like dead bodies. It smells like a dead animal, or we've all smelt it before. It's not unfamiliar.
Yeah, and Donna, you know, the challenge of recreating it's an interesting, you know, mental challenge, but I'm not sure that that's what needs. I don't know. I'm not like personally, I wouldn't want to go there, because it's like this is not something we're, you know, we want to understand it. I get what you're saying. So Donna's saying in the comments that a lot of people would be curious, probably perfumers, to recreate it or a version of it. And I know this is something that actually Aleesa was looking into as well.
Well,
originally.
I didn't want to recreate it. I wanted to know what was in it, because
To neutralize it in some way,
to
yeah.
think of like what would neutralize this. Originally, I imagined that I could propose a public artwork that would have a fountain, for example, that could neutralize this, and it's too symbolic in a war zone. I mean, it was very much like a first thought, worst thought. I think the work is to understand what it's doing, to talk about what it's doing, and to validate people's experiences beyond what I feel they even have the capacity to do themselves because of their situations. If that's of interest. I mean, to me, it's also of interest in many other capacities, in terms of just how I work with scent, because of what I care about in terms of scent. Like I rarely enjoy formulating something for the sake of it. So, and that's just the way I am. But the conceptual ties are very, very important in this particular case. But when we think about it in terms of affecting people's lives, that's really very much a conversation that I want to have with people's lives who are affected. And recreating it to me would be very, I don't know how much more I want to understand about it. I want to understand how it affects people and how to support people and how to fight to get those situations sort of, yeah, more known in the world and to fight against them, and which I've done, yeah, which I've looked at in many ways at different times in my life. Yeah, it's tough because it's not like, yeah, knowing it and working with it are two different things, I think. I don't know, maybe that's too abstract, but that's at least where I've come to be with it.
No, it makes sense. And also, I mean, you've gone through the process with this material for 2.5 years, if my memory is correct. I mean, this
Yeah.
has been something you started exploring in late 2017, even. It's almost 3 years. So, so yeah, I mean, I think initially the idea was to understand it and to neutralize it, and then I think your research has progressed to just, you know, in a way, observing, you know, and deducing. So,
yeah, I mean, and I think also just like having more conversations with more people, and yeah, the luxury that I have to just think about this is very obvious. I mean, it's, you know, it sits on my desk and in a container in which I don't have to smell it.
You have agency.
Very, very much so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Well, I hate to you know, end our week on such a, well, no, it's important to end our week on such a serious note, because this is the work we all have to do, awareness and sharing. So Aleesa, thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing the research that you've been putting together for so long. And we will be sharing this video with Aleesa's permission upon review with everybody. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you for giving me the space. And yeah, thank you everyone for listening. And I'm really open to continuing the conversation. I feel like this was just an introduction in many ways. And yeah, please be in touch if you have stuff to talk about. I'm around.
Yeah.
We all are.
Oh my.
Okay.
All right, everyone. Well, enjoy your weekend. Aleesa, thank you for your time.